Just a few days ago, a strange scene unfolded outside Taiwan's Legislative Yuan. 53 lawmakers stood before a sea of cameras, but it wasn't the data on their charts that caught everyone's eye. It was a portrait. They had taken a picture of President Ching-tei and superimposed his face onto the body of Yuan Shikai, the infamous figure who tried to crown himself emperor a century ago. The air was thick with the kind of tension you'd expect at a high-stakes protest, with leaders shouting about anti-imperialism and fighting a new dictatorship. To an outsider, it looked like a piece of aggressive performance art, yet the people holding the signs were the ones actually running the country's legislature. What's fascinating, and perhaps a bit jarring, is how we arrived at this point. It didn't start with a grand ideological schism or military crisis. It started with a dry, technical dispute over the Fiscal Allocation Act, essentially a debate over which cities get how much tax money. For weeks, it was a battle of spreadsheets. But then came the sudden dramatic turn. When the law finally passed, the executive branch did something unprecedented in Taiwan's constitutional history. They simply refused to sign the paperwork to make it official. In an instant, the conversation shifted from budget formulas to total war. One side calls this refusal a constitutional rescue to protect the treasury. The other side calls it becoming an emperor, and has responded by launching a full-scale impeachment attempt. That instantaneous pivot from arguing over tax percentages to accusing the president of destroying democracy has left the political landscape in a state of stunned paralysis. It's a logic where both sides claim to be the sole guardians of the Constitution while simultaneously accusing the other of burning it to the ground. It makes you wonder, is this actually about the law, or has the basic trust required to run a government finally evaporated? We are witnessing a standoff so intense that experts believe Taiwan is entering a constitutional crisis unlike anything seen in decades. The question is, in this game of political chicken, what happens to the country when no one is willing to blink?
That framing really, it really sets the stage for the intensity we're seeing right now. You have to understand, this entire conflict, it really centers on one specific and totally unprecedented action.
And what's that?
It's the refusal by the Executive Yuan that's led by Premier Zhongtai and backed by President Ching-tei of the DPP. The refusal to countersign the amendments to the Fiscal Allocation Act.
Right, the act everyone is fighting over.
Exactly. And that single act is where the whole constitutional crisis begins. Because, it is the very first time the cabinet has ever, in Taiwan's entire history, refused to countersign a piece of legislation.
Okay, so let's unpack that refusal, because it's not just a political disagreement, it's the physical. It's the moment the gears of government just stopped meshing.
That's a great way to put it.
We heard this incredible detail from a senior legislative staffer who was watching this all go down. They described the actual physical bill, the piece of paper, just sitting there in the Legislative Yuan,
waiting for a signature.
Waiting for a signature that was never going to come. And they said the ink of the newly passed law was turning dry and brittle. The law was voted on, it passed, and yet there it was, physically dead on arrival.
And that detail is so critical, you know? It turns what could be a very dry, abstract legal argument into this tangible symbol of complete paralysis.
It's not just a concept anymore.
Right. The countersignature, it's not normally a moment of high political drama. It's usually just a bureaucratic formality. It signals that the executive is ready to implement what the legislature has passed.
The rubber stamp, almost.
Almost, yeah. So for that physical document to just sit there, legally inert, it's the clearest sign you could possibly get that the fundamental procedural trust between the two branches has just completely evaporated. The rulebook is failing.
So let's dive into that rulebook, the Constitution, because both sides are now waving it around, citing different sections to prove that they're the ones in the right.
Yeah.
Let's start with the Executive Yuan. Premier Cho's position, the DPP's position. They're saying this refusal isn't just justified, it's necessary. What's their constitutional argument?
Well, they hang their entire case on Article 37 of the Constitution. And Article 37 says that the president promulgates laws, but, and this is the key part, it requires the countersignature of the premier.
Okay.
So the executive's argument is all about responsibility. It's about accountability. They're saying that if the premier's signature is required by the Constitution, then it has to mean something. It can't just be automatic.
So it implies a degree of judgment.
Precisely. It implies the right to exercise, or, not exercise that power. The idea is to make sure that the Executive Yuan, the branch that actually has to implement the law, can do so responsibly.
So it's a final check. It's not just an administrative box to tick.
That's exactly their argument. And Premier Cho, he explicitly framed this. He said it wasn't a veto. He called it a constitutional rescue. He insisted the move was necessary to uphold the separation of powers.
Arguing that the legislature was overstepping its bounds.
Right, that the opposition-controlled legislature was trying to dictate policy in a way that was, in his view, unconstitutional.
And he didn't just leave it at that vague idea. We know he laid out some very specific criteria, some red lines, for when the executive would refuse to sign a bill. What were they?
Yeah, and they were quite severe, which was intended to signal just how serious they saw this crisis. The first was any bill that would be destroying the country's constitutional system.
Okay, that's a high bar.
A very high bar. The second was any bill weakening national defense and security. And the third, which is the most relevant one here for the Fiscal Allocation Act, was any bill that would be undermining national fiscal discipline.
So by refusing to sign, Cho is saying this specific law, this budget law, meets that third critical, almost existential criterion. He's saying it would destroy Taiwan's finances.
That's the claim. He's elevating it from a policy dispute to a fundamental threat to the state.
But does that defense actually hold up legally? I mean, the Constitution already provides a very clear way for the executive to object to a law, right? The power of reconsideration, the veto.
And that is the absolute core of the legal conflict. That is exactly what the opposition is hammering home day in and day out.
So what's their argument?
The KMT and TPP alliance, they control the Legislative Yuan, and they point to other articles, specifically additional Article 3.2 and Article 72. These articles lay out the whole process.
Explain that for us.
It's pretty straightforward. If the cabinet of the executive objects to a bill that's been passed, they can send it back to the legislature for reconsideration. It's a veto, basically.
Which they did in this case. They sent it back.
They did. And the legislature voted on it again, and they upheld their original bill. They rejected the cabinet's veto.
So the process played out exactly as the Constitution described.
Exactly. And once the legislature rejects that veto and upholds the bill, Article 72 is crystal clear. It states the premier shall immediately accept the said bill, and the president must promulgate it within 10 days.
Shall. Must. That language doesn't sound very optional.
It's not. It's mandatory language. So the opposition is arguing that by refusing the countersignature after that whole veto process was completed and failed for the executive, Premier Cho is just. He's engaging in procedural manipulation.
So they're saying he's essentially inventing a second veto, a secret veto that isn't in the Constitution.
That's the charge. They're saying he's turning the countersignature, which is meant to be a formality at this stage, into a functional, unconstitutional super veto. And this is why you see the opposition using such dramatic language.
Right. The autocratic political branch and the imperialism, it's all starting to make sense. It's the context for those Yuan Shikai posters.
Language is definitely hyperbolic, but the procedural point they're making is it's a sound one. If the executive is allowed to just nullify the entire legislative process after the constitutional veto mechanism has been used up, well, the balance of power shifts dramatically.
It makes the legislature seem almost powerless.
It does. It transforms the premier from the head of the administration into something more like a constitutional monarch with an absolute veto. The Legislative Yuan feels their entire authority, their reason for being, has been made irrelevant by the executive just asserting this hidden power in Article 37.
Okay, so let's zoom out from the constitutional law debate for a second and look at the actual trigger, this Fiscal Allocation Act. Why did this specific fight over money become the hill that the executive was willing to die on? Why force this whole confrontation?
It really comes down to the staggering financial stakes. I mean, the numbers are just eye-watering. The opposition's amendments to the act, they were designed to drastically increase how much central government revenue goes to local governments.
Which has been a goal for a long time, right? This idea of decentralization.
For decades.
Right.
But the way they wrote this law, when the executive yuan ran the numbers, they saw an immediate fiscal collapse on the horizon.
How bad was it? What were the projections?
It would have triggered a completely different kind of constitutional crisis. The central government is bound by law, by the Budget Act, to a statutory debt ceiling.
Okay.
Right now, that ceiling is 15% of the total budget. The executive's math showed that the increased spending mandated by the opposition's bill would force them to borrow so much money that total borrowing for the next fiscal year would skyrocket to NT $560 billion.
And what percentage is that?
That's 17.1% of the total budget. So significantly over the legal 15% ceiling.
So the executive is saying, look, if we follow this new law from the legislature, we automatically break the Budget Act.
Yeah.
They're being put in a position where they have to choose which law to violate.
Precisely. Premier Cho's argument is that countersigning this bill would be like signing a death warrant for the nation's fiscal discipline. He would be legally obligated to implement the spending, but the only way to fund it would be by immediately and illegally breaking the debt ceiling law.
And so that forced choice, in his mind, is the justification for the constitutional rescue.
That's his defense. He's saying, you can't force me to sign something that compels me to break another law. It's an impossible situation.
And this incredible clash over constitutional interpretation and fiscal reality, it brings us right to the source of all this instability, which is the political landscape after the 2024 election.
Absolutely.
So let's transition into how this divided government really created the tinderbox for this crisis.
Absolutely. Because the foundation of this deadlock, which we're digging into now, it's a direct result of that 2024 election. The DPP, they won the presidency with Ching-tei, which was historic in its own way. But, and this is the crucial part, they lost control of the Legislative Yuan.
So the KMT and the TPP, this opposition alliance, they got the majority.
They did. And that set up a classic divided government. Right. This scenario, where the executive and the legislature are controlled by, frankly, deeply hostile political parties, it's inherently prone to this kind of political turmoil, especially in a system like Taiwan's, which allows for these kinds of confrontations.
And it seems like the opposition, after being out of power for so long, they just wasted no time at all. They immediately started using their new legislative majority to try and, well, hobble the executive.
That was the goal from day one, to immediately expand legislative dominance and constrain the DPP's ability to govern at every turn. The KMT and TPP saw their majority as a clear mandate to neutralize the presidency.
What were their first moves? What was the initial strategy?
Initially, they went for a big power grab. They tried to pass these huge legislative reforms that would grant them significantly more power. Things like allowing legislators to summon pretty much any official or even private citizens for questioning.
And criminalizing false statements made to the legislature, I remember that.
That's the one. It was hugely controversial. And it was met with immediate resistance, not just politically, but legally.
Right, because the Constitutional Court got involved.
It did. The Constitutional Court, the TCC, actually struck down some of those initial power grabs. The court ruled they violated the fundamental principle of separation of powers.
So that forced the KMT and TPP to change tactics.
It did. They had to adapt your strategy. So instead of just focusing on expanding their own constitutional powers, they shifted. They pivoted to a strategy of, you could call it institutional sabotage and resource blockage, basically hitting the executive where it really hurts.
So what were the key areas they targeted to, tie the executive Yuan's hands? We know they hit the budget, obviously, but what else?
They started systematically going after the institutional machinery of the state. It was quite strategic. One of their biggest moves was to drastically cut the budget of the control yuan.
Explain what the control yuan does.
It's the branch of government responsible for oversight, for impeachment, for auditing. It's supposed to be the institutional check on administrative corruption and abuse of power.
So by starving it of funds.
By starving it of funds, the opposition effectively neutralized the government's main oversight arm. They constrained its ability to run investigations or audits, especially any that might target their own political allies. It was a very clever use of the budget to achieve an institutional goal.
What about on the policy front?
Well, there they started reallocating huge chunks of the national budget, trying to redirect money away from DPP priorities and towards their own. They also moved to suspend major, long-fought-for policies, like the pension reforms that the previous DPP administration had managed to pass.
And then there was the defense budget.
And then there was the defense budget, which, given the external security environment Taiwan faces, was just staggering. They blocked the defense budget.
It's hard to see that as anything other than a political escalation, regardless of how you feel about the other issues.
It's pure escalation. And on top of that, they started pushing these highly sensitive security-related proposals. For example, proposing to allow Chinese spouses who have dual nationality to hold public office in Taiwan.
For a government that is so preoccupied with infiltration and national security, that must have been seen as a direct provocation.
It was perceived as highly malicious. These moves were designed to maximize political discomfort for the DPP. So you can see this pattern of escalation. And the refusal to countersign the Fiscal Allocation Act, it really came at the end of this long chain of events. The executive finally felt they just couldn't keep following normal procedures for laws they genuinely believed were malicious and were destroying the structural integrity of the Constitution.
But the incredible irony here is that the one body that is designed to referee this exact kind of constitutional fight, the Constitutional Court, the TCC, is completely out of commission. We're watching this fight unfold with the referee tied up on the sidelines.
And that paralysis is probably the most significant strategic victory the opposition has achieved. It's what makes this whole crisis so incredibly dangerous. The TCC has been, for all intents and purposes, shut down for over a year now, since October 28th, 2024.
How did they do it? How do you just shut down the highest court in the land?
It was a very surgical, two-pronged political operation by the KMT and TPP coalition. Really quite brilliant, tactically.
Okay, let's break that down. What were the first prong, the first step?
The first step was to create vacancies on the court. The terms of 7 grand justices expired at the same time at the end of October 2024. So President Lai, he nominated replacements. He tried to keep the court functional.
But the legislature has to confirm them.
Exactly. And the Legislative Yuan, now controlled by the KMT and TPP, just systematically rejected all 7 of the president's nominations. Every single one. And that refusal left the 15-seat court with only 8 incumbent justices remaining, well below full strength.
So they used their power over nominations to make sure the court was understaffed. That's the setup. What was the second part of the strategy, the part that actually neutralized it?
That was the knockout blow. They passed an amendment to the Constitutional Court Procedure Act, the CCPA. Before this, the quorum requirement for the court to even hear and rule on a case was lower.
Okay.
The KMT-TPP coalition passed a new amendment that jacked up the quorum requirement to 10 justices.
10. Knowing full well that they had just blocked the nominations, leaving only 8 justices on the court.
It's procedural genius, or, procedural sabotage, depending on your point of view.
Sounds like sabotage.
It's brilliant tactical maneuvering. You've only got 8 incumbent justices. You set the quorum at 10. The math is simple. The court can never meet the quorum, so it is legally unable to function. They can't hold hearings. They can't issue injunctions. And they certainly can't rule on the constitutionality of this very crisis we were talking about.
So they can't weigh in on the Fiscal Allocation Act dispute or the executive's refusal to sign? Nothing.
Nothing. It's a complete vacuum of constitutional order. And this isn't just some abstract political inconvenience. The real, tangible impact on the judicial system and on average citizens is immense.
What does that look like on the ground?
It's a disaster. The paralysis has halted over 385 pending cases. And crucially, 354 of those cases were constitutional petitions filed by ordinary people.
People seeking protection of their rights.
Yes, people whose fundamental rights might have been violated by the government or by a flawed law. Their cases are now frozen indefinitely. Their access to the highest level of constitutional justice is just. It's gone, wiped out by a quorum requirement.
And this vacuum, it's created a whole other crisis within the judiciary itself, hasn't it? The remaining justices are apparently divided over whether they should even follow the law that is paralyzing them.
That's right. The terms they're using for this debate is judicial self-protection. The core question is, should the justices comply with this legally enacted CCPA amendment, even though they know it was designed specifically to neutralize them, or should they assert their own independence and strike down the paralyzing amendment itself?
What are the two sides of that argument within the court?
Well, you have a group of 4 justices who support striking down the CCPA. Their argument is that the court isn't bound by procedures that are so clearly unconstitutional in their effect. The effect being the nullification of the entire judicial branch. They believe they have to act to save the constitutional structure.
So they want to break the procedural law to save the court from being broken.
That's a good way to put it. But on the other side, you have 3 other justices who hold a very strict legalist position. They argue they must follow the CCPA because it was legally enacted by the legislature. It's the law of the land, period.
Even if it shuts them down.
Even if it shuts them down. They believe that if the court were to just unilaterally declare the CCPA unconstitutional and convene under the old rules, they would be expanding their own power unconstitutionally. So their strict adherence to the letter of the law means they were refusing to participate in any deliberation on the case because they can't legally meet the 10-justice quorum.
So those 3 legalist justices are effectively ensuring the paralysis continues. They're boycotting the very process that could save the court.
Exactly. The constitutional gridlock in the political branches is now perfectly mirrored within the judiciary itself. And this isn't just partisan politics anymore. This is a deep institutional crisis where the formal rules are being used as weapons.
And that institutional breakdown, it guarantees that the original issue, the fight over the budget, can't be resolved legally. It can only be resolved through raw political power and high-stakes maneuvering.
Which brings us right back to the battle over the budget and the history behind this Fiscal Allocation Act.
Right, because when we talk about this act, we're really talking about a structural problem that has been festering for decades. The law itself hasn't been meaningfully changed in over 25 years, since 1999.
And that's a key point. This isn't some sudden new idea invented by the opposition. This fight is the result of 25 years of ignored pleas for reform. And it's all centered on this concept of fiscal decentralization.
Centralization versus decentralization.
Right, and the entire structure of power that flows from who controls the money.
So how does the current system work, the centralized one? Why does it create so much friction at the local level?
The current system, which has been in place for decades, funnels the vast majority of all tax revenue. We were talking national income taxes, consumption taxes, corporate taxes. All of it goes directly to the central government in Taipei.
And then Taipei decides who gets what.
Exactly. The central government then decides through all these complex formulas and mechanisms how much money to give back to local governments. And this severely limits the financial autonomy of those local governments. They have very little power to raise their own taxes or direct their own spending on local priorities.
So cities and counties are perpetually dependent on the goodwill of the central government, which is obviously a tremendous lever of political power for whichever party is in charge in Taipei.
It is the ultimate political lever. The whole dispute boils down to one question: who controls resource allocation? If the central government controls the purse strings, they control influence, they control which projects get built, and ultimately they control votes at the local level.
And the opposition's proposed amendment was an attempt to change that relationship fundamentally.
It was an attempt to re-engineer it completely, to allow a much larger, fixed percentage of national revenue to automatically flow to the local level, no questions asked.
It really helps to shift the focus from all the technical arguments happening in the Capitol to the actual impact this has on the ground. We found this perfect example: a village chief in a southern county who sees this legal fight not as abstract politics, but as, well, a moral issue.
That's right. For people who live far away from the Legislative Yuan, this act is deeply personal. This village chief, he views the lack of local funding not as some policy preference, but as a historical debt that the central government owes to the regions.
And for him, the money isn't for grand projects.
Not at all. For him, the proposed local allocation is desperately needed for basic quality of life infrastructure. Things like repairing cracked roads that are genuinely dangerous and making sure local health clinics are fully staffed instead of running on bare bones.
So for the small people, as he put it, living out in the South, this constitutional stalemate in Taipei translates directly into potholes and limited access to a doctor. They feel like they're being held hostage.
It creates an incredibly powerful political narrative for the KMT and TPP opposition. They can position themselves as the champions of the local people, fighting against this centralized, wealthy, uncaring DPP government in the capital.
It explains the urgency of their push, even if the price is a constitutional crisis.
Absolutely. They are responding to a very real, deep-seated demand for more fiscal autonomy at the local level.
But this leads us to the crucial political economy of it all. The DPP isn't just protecting the nation's debt ceiling, they're also protecting their own political influence, because the local power landscape heavily favors the KMT.
Exactly. And this is the heart of the DPP's strategic worry. If they allow all this central government money to just flow automatically to the local level, those funds will be managed primarily by KMT-controlled administrations.
What do the numbers look like there?
If you look at the 2022 local elections, the results were a landslide for the opposition. The KMT won 14 cities and counties. The DPP only won 5.
So if this law passes, the money becomes KMT money to be spent strategically at the local level.
That's the fear. The KMT gains a massive new source of funding for patronage and influence. They become the local heroes who finally delivered the funds, which would further erode the DPP's already limited influence at the grassroots level. The DPP fears this could consolidate KMT local power for the next decade.
Yeah, there's also the risk of blame.
Right. The DPP also argues that without central oversight, these huge new allocations could lead to poor governance outcomes, mismanagement, maybe corruption, and the central government, the DPP, would ultimately get the blame from voters for the chaos.
So for the DPP, refusing to countersign is a move that, in their eyes, simultaneously defends the nation's fiscal limits and strategically defends the party's long-term political viability.
It's a strategic conflict designed to ensure that if the money goes out, it goes out on the executive's terms with central oversight, not just as a blank check mandated by the legislature.
And because they drew that hard line in the sand, it forced the opposition's hand, leading us into this dangerous game of political chicken, where the stakes move from money to institutional existence.
A very dangerous game.
The opposition's immediate countermove was, of course, the impeachment request against President Lai, complete with the performance art of holding up the Yuan Shikai image. We have to analyze this move. Is it a realistic legal threat, or is it purely political theater?
It is. It's almost entirely political theater, or what some political scientists call public opinion warfare. Yeah. The whole tactical purpose is narrative control.
To frame the debate.
Exactly. The opposition's goal is to seize the headlines, to dominate the news cycle, and to depict the president as a dictator who has destroyed democracy. This, in turn, justifies their own role as the supposed guardians of the Constitution.
That makes perfect sense in the context of the highly polarized media environment we've been talking about. But let's just look at the legal mechanics. Why is the impeachment request basically doomed to fail from the start?
Because impeachment is designed to be incredibly difficult. It requires a 2/3 supermajority in the Legislative Yuan. In Taiwan, that translates to 76 votes.
And the opposition doesn't have that.
Not even close. The KMT and TPP alliance, combined, they only hold about 62 seats in total. They're substantially short of the required supermajority. And they know this. They know the motion will fail. But the act of filing it is what matters to them.
It's an information weapon.
It is. It dominates the news. It forces the president and the premier to spend all their time defending themselves against these accusations of dictatorship instead of focusing on their own policy agenda.
It changes the conversation.
Completely. One commentator noted how this action, when it's amplified by all the partisan talk shows, it transforms the constitutional nuance, all the arguments over Article 37 and 72.
Yeah.
It boils all that down into a simple, visceral battle cry that really resonates with their base.
So they're taking this solemn tool of impeachment and turning it into a tactical PR weapon.
Exactly. It's all about dominating the narrative and mobilizing your voters by defining the conflict as a simple story of good versus evil.
But the executive has its own counterweapon in this standoff, a kind of constitutional grenade. Premier Cho, by holding the line so firmly on the countersignature, he is essentially daring the opposition to pull the only other real constitutional trigger they have.
And that's where the real danger lies. The no-confidence vote against Premier Cho. The premier practically invited it. He said that if he were to be brought down by a legislature that tramples on the Constitution, it would be a Democratic badge of honor for him.
That is a direct dare.
It's throwing down the gauntlet.
So why is the no-confidence vote the real constitutional weapon here? And why is the opposition so afraid to use it, even though they have the simple majority they would need to pass it?
Because if that no-confidence vote passes, and the KMT-TPP alliance certainly has the votes to do it, the entire institutional landscape changes in an instant. The president, Ching-tei, then gains the constitutional right to dissolve the Legislative Yuan within 10 days.
Dissolution. That would trigger new legislative elections within 60 days. Has this ever happened before?
Never. Not under Taiwan's current constitutional framework. It is the highest possible escalation. The ultimate constitutional checkmate.
It's the president's check on a hostile legislature.
It is. In Taiwan's unique semi-presidential system, the president can't just fire the premier, but the legislature can dismiss the premier with a no-confidence vote. The catch, the poison pill, is that this action then empowers the president to dissolve the very body that fired the premier. It forces the legislature to risk its own existence to exercise its check on the executive.
So the strategic stalemate becomes crystal clear. The DPP, the executive, they're holding this hard, unprecedented line because they know their constitutional escape hatch, their check, is forcing the opposition into a corner. They either have to accept the executive's functional veto or risk losing their majority completely in a snap election.
That is the game of chicken, and the DPP strategists would likely welcome that outcome. They believe new elections would break the current legislative deadlock, and they're betting that public opinion might turn against the opposition's hardball tactics, potentially giving the DPP a majority again.
Allowing the president to actually govern.
Right.
And the opposition. They've clearly signaled they're not going to pull that trigger despite all their anger over the Fiscal Act.
They're terrified of new elections. The KMT and TPP alliance spent years clawing their way to this legislative majority. They are absolutely unwilling to risk derailing that control. Their tactical calculation is very precise.
Yeah, so?
They have the majority to pass laws and to block the executive. But they lack the 76 votes they need to actually impeach the president. And they lack the political confidence to risk an immediate re-election by dismissing the premier. So they remain frozen, powerful, but unable to deliver the final blow.
And this entire stalemate isn't happening in a vacuum. It's being magnified and amplified by an intensely polarized media environment, which ensures the public is processing this whole dispute through very strong ideological filters.
The media environment is absolutely key to understanding why this conflict is so resilient, why it doesn't just fizzle out. One analyst described reality in Taiwan as being broken up into fractured, fragmented, and ideologized information spaces.
There's no shared reality.
There's no shared reality. There's only partisan reporting. You have media conglomerates with very distinct political leanings, and they engage in highly selective reporting. It ensures that KMT supporters only see the Yuan Shikai as a dictator narrative, while DPP supporters only see the constitutional rescue narrative.
And the rise of new media platforms, that's certainly accelerated this fragmentation, especially with younger voters?
Oh, absolutely. The 2024 election gave us some fascinating data on this. YouTube and TikTok have become crucial electoral battlegrounds. TPP candidate Ko Wen-jae, for instance, he was the undisputed king of YouTube.
How did he manage that?
He used live streams and short-form video to completely bypass the legacy media. He connected directly with younger voters who felt the two traditional parties didn't speak to them. The TPP just understood and leveraged that short-form video format better than anyone else.
And meanwhile, the ruling party, the DPP, has created a kind of information deficit for itself by deliberately avoiding TikTok.
That's a huge strategic choice they've made. The DPP views TikTok as a platform that is potentially controlled by or influenced by Beijing, and they believe that even engaging with it gives it legitimacy.
Which aligns with their national security narrative.
It does, but it also creates an immediate barrier to reaching a massive segment of younger voters who use that platform as their primary source of news. It leaves that entire information space wide open for opposition narratives and, more worryingly, for foreign influence campaigns.
Which brings up that connection to external influence. We've seen analysis showing that China's tactics have matured. They're focusing less on promoting a positive image of the PRC and more on just actively exploiting the domestic divisions that already exist in Taiwan.
Yes, the analysis that came out about 4 weeks before the election was pretty sobering. It revealed these deep collaborative links between China's official propaganda system and certain pan-blue or pro-KMT media accounts and social media groups in Taiwan.
What were they doing?
They were frequently quoting each other, essentially working in tandem to amplify anti-DPP and, crucially, anti-U.S. narratives. The focus was always on Taiwan's internal flaws, on its dysfunction.
So the very inability of the KMT and DPP to cooperate, this internal constitutional crisis we're analyzing, it perfectly aligns with a strategic goal to divide and conquer Taiwan from the outside. The polarization isn't just an internal problem, it's a weakness that's being actively exploited.
And that polarization is relentless. The political environment is so bitter that even after the election, partisans just continue to attack each other with maximum vitriol. It makes any kind of cross-party cooperation virtually impossible. This conflict, therefore, it's not a momentary lapse. It's a symptom of a deep strategic rift that seems designed to persist.
So if we just step back and try to summarize this entire situation, this ongoing standoff, from the unprecedented refusal to countersign a law to the calculated political risk of impeachment and dissolution, it really highlights a major systemic vulnerability in Taiwan's democratic structure.
It does. Specifically in its semi-presidential system. It shows just how fragile that system can be when the president and the legislative majority belong to these deeply opposed parties. The checks and balances, which are supposed to provide resilience, instead they become institutional weapons used to grind the machinery of government to a halt.
And the cost of inaction here, the cost of this stalemate continuing, it seems potentially catastrophic for Taiwan's domestic stability and its international standing.
The cost is incredibly high. This lack of basic mutual trust means the confrontation is threatening to just persist indefinitely. The next national election isn't until 2028. This deadlock could easily continue until the next local elections in 2026 or beyond.
And this prolonged instability, it risks damaging democratic processes and, most practically, stalling the crucial domestic policies that actually affect people's lives.
We've already seen the impact. The opposition has blocked defense spending. The entire general budget process is now at risk.
What happens if they can't pass a budget?
If the annual budget isn't passed by the end of the year because of this political standoff, spending levels are automatically maintained at the current year's rates. That prevents the government from responding to new strategic defense needs, from implementing new infrastructure projects, or even just addressing inflation. The failure to govern effectively becomes a direct threat to the country's ability to function.
What's so sobering about all this is that Taiwan's democratic stability, it's now being tested not primarily by external military crises, which is what usually grabs the international headlines, but by this internal institutional conflict, by the complete erosion of the basic trust you need to simply run a government.
And because of the opposition's coordinated strategic effort to paralyze the Constitutional Court, the established neutral referee that's supposed to mediate these disputes, it's non-functional. And that absence guarantees that this conflict will remain a high-stakes, uncompromising game of political maneuvering between the executive and the legislature, until one side is finally willing to blink, either by backing down on the fiscal bill or by risking everything in a new election. The rulebook simply remains broken.